Hi everyone, welcome to the presentation on writing and presenting a literature review. This will be really a brand new presentation. We didn't cover this in Residency 1. This will be completely new, though information you probably might already know. If you've had 625, you're going to be doing a lot of this in 625, so this is kind of complementary to that. Hopefully, if you're in the normal cycle, you should be taking 625 soon after this residency, so it will be helpful for that as well. So, a literature review is a review of research. It's used to support what you're going to be doing. If you're doing an academic article for a journal, it's used to support that academic article. If you're doing a dissertation, it's used as support for your dissertation. I like to think of it as an argument that you're making that says the research that you're doing is important and has not been done before. You're basically trying to convince people through your literature review that no one has done this topic before and that it's an important topic for you to study, that it means something to the world, it means something to the field, is typically what a dissertation is, a literature review for a dissertation is all about. There are different other types of literature reviews. Sometimes people are using a bunch of literature to make a new point. You can actually analyze literature to create a new whole idea by pulling together a bunch of different people's articles. And that is a type of qualitative research. However, that's not what you would do for a dissertation. Really, when your literature review is going to be chapter 2 of your dissertation, and it will be used, like I said, to justify not only your study, but to show that there is research to back up what you're doing, that you're not just creating something brand new out of the air, yet you're actually taking theories and ideas that have been presented before and you're adding to them, you're pulling them out. So when you get to the end of your dissertation, in chapter 5, you're actually going to be pulling in the research that you presented in your literature review to talk about your findings. So it's kind of like, this is what they've said before, this is what I found, and how it connects to what they said before, but here's the new thing that what I found also shows. So a literature review typically has an introduction, a body, conclusions. Really, ultimately, if for a dissertation, it is really the introduction and the body, and then kind of a summary of what you found is what you're going to find in the dissertation. Literature reviews can be organized in many different ways. It is common to see literature reviews done in several different ways. For a dissertation, the structure is often thematic, meaning that you look at different themes that you want to discuss that are connected to the ultimate topic that you're studying. You can also do chronological, where you talk about the past studies and the seminal research and then move to currently what's going on in the field. You can also follow trends this way from their start to where they currently are. The chronological organization for a literature review is not as common simply because typically a literature review has several bodies of research. Now, you could do a chronological look at each of the bodies of research that you're discussing, and that would be more likely to be seen in a dissertation than just a purely chronological. There's also a methodological way to organize your literature review, and that often depends on whether or not what you're doing is some kind of newer type of research, or if you are doing, for example, if all the research has typically been qualitative and you're going to do a quantitative study, you may want to show the evolution of the research through the methodology. This basically is done to show that the methodology you're using is going to be the best one for this subject. Again, that's not typical in a dissertation because most of the time you're not going to be trying to use a new methodology. So the literature review is going to typically be like a funnel. It's going to look at the broader picture first, then it's going to go down and look at more details by breaking things down into subtopics, and then it's going to go down into studies that are more similar to the study you're doing. You should be able to find studies that are in some way similar to what you've done, but not the same study as you're going to do. You may find studies that mirror your methodology or studies that mirror your topic, but we're going for different points, or we're looking at it in a different way, but they still connect it to your topic more closely, and that's really what the bottom of the triangle is. And that's where you eventually are showing the world there's a gap. Sure, I'm studying women who are in the police force and their leadership, and Smith, 2016, also studied women's leadership in the police force, but Smith was looking specifically at their relationship with their managers. I'm looking at their relationships with their employees, with their underlings. So you're basically creating the gap, showing the gap, and then saying how you're going to fill the gap, of course in the third person. So to me, this is my favorite way of thinking about a literature review, and everybody can look at things differently, so it's not wrong or right, it's just my way, but I think it kind of leads to a better understanding of what a literature review is about. Typically, when you're thinking of a topic, there are bodies of literature that connect to that topic. If I'm looking at women's leadership, specifically women who are CEOs, I want to look at women who are CEOs, and that's what I want to study. Well, there are bodies of literature that connect to that idea. There's leadership literature, there's literature on CEOs, and then there's literature on women in the workplace. Those big bodies of literature may have nothing to do with the topic I'm interested in. CEOs could study CEOs of all different types, men, women, minorities. It could be looking at CEOs of Fortune 500 companies. It could be looking at CEOs of small businesses. Leadership could be looking at leadership in the church, leadership in the police, leadership in the army. It could be looking at leadership on many different levels. Women in the workplace, again, could study women all the way down from a cashier all the way up to a CEO. You just don't know. Those giant bodies of literature, however, will have areas where they overlap. And those three overlapping areas are the three areas that you will write about in your literature review. So you will find articles that talk about CEOs and leadership. You'll find articles that talk about women's leadership, and you'll find articles that talk about women as CEOs. Those three bodies of overlap, those are what makes up your literature review. So you want your literature review to connect at least two of the major themes together. Sometimes you may find articles that connect all three, but you really shouldn't. And that's the little hole in the center of the three circles. That's the gap in the research that you're going to actually study with your study. Your study fills in that hole that connects all three of the bodies of literature together, connects leadership, CEOs, and women. All three. That's your study. That's the gap. One of the things you're going to want to do in a literature review is to talk about the connections between the research and how they inform or disagree with one another. So you're going to look to be doing evaluation while you're doing your literature review. You're going to want to be sure in a literature review that you have very few one-author quotes or some paraphrasing. you really want to look at the literature as a whole, as a body, and not just do one-offs. You don't want to say, Rankin said blah, 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 Smith said blah, 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 Jones said blah, blah, blah. You don't want to do that. You don't want to line up literature like that. That is not the correct way of doing a literature review. Instead, most of your citations in a literature review should be multiple authors that you're citing that all agree about one idea. You may, if an author is seminal, if they're really big in the field, you may have a one author paragraph, but most often you're going to be bringing in multiple authors, either by comparing them, their agreement. Similarly, author B points to. Likewise, author C makes the case. Author D also makes the point. Again, it's possible to see how author E agrees with author D. Or disagreements. However, author B points to this as being this cause. On the other hand, author C says that this is the issue. Conversely, author D argues, nevertheless, what author E suggests is dumb. So you will be adding in this kind of evaluation of the literature by comparing it to itself. The important thing to understand about a literature review is this is not your opinion, but your voice still needs to be there. And your voice is there by the way you present the literature, by the points from the literature that you're pulling out and presenting to us, and by the way you compare the literature to each other, one to the other. Those are actually going to be the ways that you make your argument, the ways that you bring out your voice. When you're writing a literature review, you're going to do a rough draft, and then you're going to edit it, and then you're going to do a final draft, and then you're going to edit it, and then you're going to edit it again, and then you're going to give it to your chair, and your chair is going to give you a whole bunch of feedback, and then you're going to edit it again. And then it's going to go to your committee, and your committee is going to give you a bunch of feedback, and then you're going to edit it again. A literature review for a dissertation is something that has gone through many revisions. Not just one, but several revisions over and over again until it becomes a tight document that tells a cohesive story that is organized in a way that makes sense and guides the reader to the conclusion at the end of chapter 2 that this is a study that needs to be done. That's why I like to say it's kind of an argument or a persuasive document. You're persuading the reader that your research needs to be done. You also want to make sure that you're bringing in other people. You want to make sure your literature review is clear. Do they understand what you're trying to say? Does it flow? Does it make sense to the reader? Is it complete? Do the readers feel like that they're missing something? Do they have a question that was left unanswered? Statements without citations. Those kind of things are the things that you need to look for. You should never make a statement without a citation. A statement is where you're saying something that sounds like it's a fact. And if you don't have a citation for it, then you can't say it. Now, you can do transition sentences where you present an idea that you're going to talk about with citations in the future. Transition sentences are necessary in a dissertation literature review to make it flow. The reader needs to know, why are you bringing up the point that you're bringing up? Don't just bring up a series of points. You must have a story there. It must connect. It must make sense. And an outside reader will be able to kind of look at that and say, I don't understand this. Why did you go from talking about the grass is green to talking about the sky is blue? Why did you change? What's that? And then when you're talking about the sky, you talk about I want to say metachlorians. You talk about the ozone layer. Well, then you mention it, but what about the ozone layer? I want to know more. Is the ozone layer important? Those are the kind of questions that when your reader is asking you, you realize you have not said enough. You're confusing the reader by either bringing in points that aren't necessary or by not explaining the points you did bring in. A good literature review is focused. The topic should be narrow. You should only present ideas and only report on studies that are closely related to your topic. Don't just bring in things to look fancy. Your literature review should be concise, meaning that your ideas should be presented economically. Don't take any more space than you need to. It should be logical. The flow within and among paragraphs should be smooth. There should be a logical progression from one idea to the next. You need to make sure that your literature review is developed. Don't leave the story half told. Make sure that you are developing the literature and that you've presented everything that needs to be presented to make your point. But again, go back to point one, it needs to be focused. So you need to say everything you need to make the reader understand your study and why it's important, but you don't want to bring in extra information that's not needed. So while you don't want to leave the story of your topic half told, you don't want to bring in stuff that is not related just because you want to develop out some other things. Oh, I think it would be good if they knew about this. No, don't bring it in. Integrative. Your paper should stress how ideas in the studies are related. Focus on the big picture. What commonality do the studies that you're presenting share? How do the research that you're presenting connect to your study? Are there differences? Your paper should really look at the literature and review it. Hence, it's called a literature review. And of course, current. 80% of your citations must be within the last 5 years. This is done to make sure your dissertation is current. It's done to make sure that you've proven that no one else recently has done the same study that you have done. The 5-year rule is 5 years past the current year. So for us in 2017, that includes 2016, 2015, 2014, 2013, and 2012, all the way back to 2012. Now, should your dissertation approval process go on, and you end up crossing into 2018, oops, that means all your 2012 citations are now invalid. You're going to have to go in and find more modern, more current work. The same is true for when you publish from your dissertation. You'll defend your dissertation, and then you'll spend a year not wanting to look at it at all. And then you'll go into a job, and you'll be working in your new job, so it'll take a year to get used to your new job. And then you're going to come back, and you're going to be like, I want to publish a paper from my dissertation. You're going to have to update your references. You can't use the same old references that you were using before. And that's just going to be a way of life for an academic, which is why we enforce these rules here at CityU. What are some of the pitfalls of a literature review? Vague, too much or inappropriate generalizations, a limited range. You only focus on one idea or one theme, and you don't bring in enough information about the other things that are related to your topic. Irrelevant material, oh, that's the worst. You have a whole bunch of stuff that isn't important. Why does it matter that this author said this 20 years ago? How does that connect to now? How does that connect to what you're doing? Omission of a contrasting view. I mean, typically in research, somebody's going to come up and say, no, I think this is the case, or no, I think this is the case. If there's contrasting research available and you don't use it, you're not filling in the whole picture for your audience, and you're leaving out what someone can then come later and say that you left out just because your point wasn't strong enough. And then again, the omission of recent work, not showing that you are the most up to date and that you're on the cutting edge and not 5 years behind. A summary table is useful to prepare to help you understand the literature. This is an organizational method, and there are several organizational methods. I used mind mapping when I did mine, and mind mapping is a thing where you draw circles and lines to connect circles together. Circles represent topics. Squares represent individual articles. You connect the articles to the topics. You connect the topics to themes. And you do all that on a map that's like a guideline. A summary of the literature is similar to that. It allows you to make sense of large amounts of information. This is something that you can keep as you're doing your readings. It's important that you keep notes about your readings. If you're not using Zotero or Mendeley or EndNote, you should be doing that now. You should keep notes on every article you read, even if the article is bad. There has been several times that I have had an article be really bad, and I have made a note. This is not a useful article. It is methodologically unsound, or it is not related to the topic that it seems like at all. And then I will go later on, like 2 or 3 weeks later, and be looking at the literature, and I'll find the same article, and I'll be like, ooh, this article looks great. And I'll look to see if I've seen it before, and sure enough, I have, and I already know that it's horrible. I don't waste my time rereading it again. This is an example of a summary of literature. It basically is talking about the sample size. It's talking about the environment or the population that was studied, the methodology, and any conclusions that the person came to. This is a great way to keep large amounts of information organized by theme. Citation styles. It's important that you are citing properly. There is information prominent citations, where you lead with the information and then you cite at the end of the sentence. And there's author prominent citations, in which you're leading with the authors and you're presenting the information after you say who presented it. You can see the examples here. In your dissertation, you should not be leading with author-heavy paragraphs. As a matter of fact, you should never start a paragraph with the author initially. You need to have some kind of transition before you get into the work. You also shouldn't be using informational prominent citations before you transition into what you're talking about in that paragraph. They should connect. The author's information should connect. It is good to bookend citations. If you're going to be talking about the same author, then it's good to start with an author prominent citation and then end with an information citation once you finish talking about that author. It's also important to put in context. So when you say something like several authors have suggested, what you're saying is that this idea that you're presenting is very common in the literature. These are important citations for a literature review, because a literature review should be tying together large amounts of information, hundreds of citations together to make points. It shouldn't be just an individual author as often as it should be several authors agreeing or several authors discussing an idea. You should use, where appropriate, both active and passive voice. As a general rule, use active voice unless there's a good reason not to. Third person often requires a greater use of the passive voice, and this is just something that you can't get around if you're avoiding using the author, the researcher, or you're using I. And that is an important thing to remember. It's better to take the actor out of the sentence, and sometimes when you take the actor out of the sentence, you have to convert to passive voice. But in general, you want to use active voice as much as possible. There are many different kind of verbs that you can use to talk about an author, what an author has said. There are many slides that you can get for this. So look for, on the internet, you can look for ways to introduce literature. Argues, the author argues, asserts, assumes, claims, contends, contradicts, describes, finds, examines, proposes, observed. Always use past tense when talking about studies, always. The author observed, the author did, the author, that one confused me for a second, I'm not thinking, but just use past tense whenever talking about it. It's also important not to anthropomorphize. The study argues, a study can't argue. It's very important that when you're using action verbs, reporting verbs, you realize it has to be a person, it has to be the author of this study that did this, not the study itself, not the data. Data can't refute, data can't claim. Those are things that only a person can do. The author claims from the data that. Verb tenses. When you are writing your initial chapters 1 through 3, you're going to be using future tense. When you're talking about the study, like your chapter, you're going to use present tense. This chapter provides a basis for the next text. If you're talking about a generally accepted fact, there are 3 factors that control the concentration of aluminum in seawater. You can use present tense. A review of current research work or the research work of immediate relevance to your study. At this point, you would not use present tense. No. You'd still want to use past tense. Because all research work should be presented in past tense. It's better to believe that and understand that than to try to look for the exceptions. Past tense should be used to report the findings and conclusions of past research. Thus, past tense is past tense. So anytime you're presenting research, you're going to present it in the past because that's when it was done. Present perfect you may use when you're talking about several authors. Several studies have provided support for joint roughness has been characterized. It's still looking at the past, but they call it present perfect. Many studies have been, fewer resources have examined. There has been extensive research. So again, you're talking about the present perfect there. So let's talk a little bit, just a reminder about some of the common errors that you're going to see in doing a literature review. Hurrying through the review to get started could mean that you'll miss something that will improve your research. You don't want to not have done a thorough review of the research before you start writing. You're going to need to read a lot of articles, 100, 200, 300 articles. You may not use all of them, but you're going to need to have read them. Does that mean you read them cover to cover, word for word? No. You may just read the introduction. You may just read the literature review. You may only read the findings, the results. Sometimes the literature review will give you really good ideas about where to search for literature for your own study. The goal, though, is that you are very conclusive in your search through the literature so that you don't suddenly find a new vein of literature after you've already started writing your literature review. Don't rely heavily on secondary sources. You want to use primary articles, which means articles that somebody did research in and are presenting their research for you, not an article that is a lit review of other people's work. You want to do primary sources, not secondary sources. Oftentimes, people will only concentrate on the findings and not the methods. The methods help put context on the sources. You don't always need to discuss the methods, but occasionally you are going to want to point out that it was a quantitative study or it was a qualitative study so that you can put in better context what the findings were. If somebody studied 10 people in a qualitative study and you're trying to say that the results of that study can be applied to the whole population, that's just not true. You're making a mistake there. It is also a problem if you overlook sources other than journals. You can use other sources, they just need to be of high quality. However, that being said, the majority of your sources should be academic articles. Books should be the next level after that. Below that, then you can have other kind of sources such as statistics from websites, the U.S. government, those kind of things. Newspaper articles should typically not be used unless they're bringing in information about a current event or something that applies to your research. And in that case, you need to use well-known newspapers, not like the National Enquirer. Searching too broad or too narrow will also become problematic. That's where the 3-circle rule comes in, because you know the bodies of literature that you're looking in. You don't want to stray too far out of those bodies of literature. You also don't want to get too narrow, where the point that you can't find more than a few articles about a topic. And your chair is going to help you with this. That's what the chair is for, is to help you to characterize the literature and how you find it. And then inaccuracy of of compiling the bibliographic information. So you leave off important information about a journal article, like the publisher or the publishing city, and then you try to go back and find it, and you can't find that article again. It's very important to keep good APA references for every article that you find. It's very important that you connect those references with the work that you're doing so that you know what you've used and what you haven't used. Organization is the key to keep you from having to spend days and days and days trudging through your dissertation to make sure that everything matches. And believe me, you're going to have to do that at some point. You don't want to do it more than once, and you want to make sure it's easy when you do it. Okay, if you have any questions, please email them. And I look forward to seeing how you enjoyed this presentation.